We are talking Burial Ground Massacre. It's directed by Daniel Delstom and David Geer. Geer actually also co-wrote the movie, and stars Michael Madsen and Chelsea Vale. Now, what's the story here? It's essentially a low-budget slasher movie, but with a little bit of a qualifier because it adds a little wrinkle into it. The basic synopsis is this. We have a group of somewhat wealthy kind of college kids, I suppose, partying in one of their houses when the parents of this particular kind of kid are going away for the weekend. Now, this house is huge. It's got its own tennis courts. It's got a bowling alley in it. It's a massive house, obviously coming from a very wealthy family. But the kicker here is this house is actually built on Native American burial ground. And this is kind of a point in the movie that will kind of be quite important because it's ultimately about the Native American kind of history, really, and how they were treated by, obviously, the white man, so to speak. And, you know, this is all known. They know it's kind of built on this kind of burial ground. It's not something that's kind of revealed necessarily. Anyway, we have these kind of like these 6 kids, one of which is the kind of the son of the owners. And they're having this kind of party, as you do. Yet there seems to be a masked intruder skulking around the property. There seems to be a curse that is related to this kind of particular ring that kind of is one of the kind of the artifacts that the owner of the house has kind of collected. And there's also a crime element involved here as well. What'll happen? Well, you'll just have to watch the movie to find out. So let's discuss, first of all, what I think works in this movie. So, at its core, this could be classed as a slasher movie. But one of the more interesting things I think that you can say about this film is it tries to kind of like blend a slasher and crime element here. So we have this character, this slasher, ultimately, who is this masked man, and he is essentially a hired criminal. He's hired to kind of like get in there and retrieve the ring and also kind of kill anyone that sort of gets in his way. But he kind of acts like a slasher. So it's a typical slasher in a way, you know, a masked killer running around a house killing kind of teenagers. But he's not like an ominous sort of supernatural or psychopath, although arguably that may be still the case with this one. But he's actually there as a paid criminal to retrieve something, but the way he acts is kind of like a slasher. So it's a weird dichotomy, really, because it's kind of like caught between two sort of genres, really. We have this ultimately what is a home invasion with a kind of a paid professional criminal there to kind of steal something and doesn't mind kind of killing people if he has to. But he acts kind of like a slasher, running around in kind of like a scary mask with, you know, Native American weapons, spouting lots of kind of like, you know, interesting dialogue, let me just say that, about kind of Native American history, stuff like this. But it's interesting, I suppose. I appreciate the attempt to have a slasher here who's not just a masked maniac. He actually has, you know, a motivation, so to speak, and it kind of connects to other characters that are kind of introduced a little bit later on, which I think gives the movie a little bit of an original element to a point. In fact, the last act is very much about the more of the crime element to it, and kind of how that kind of informs the rest of the sort of story here. I have to say as well, the house that they're shooting in is a great location for a kind of a horror movie, because it really is kind of like a massively extravagant house that I think is kind of feels like its own character in some ways. And the movie does try and have a kind of a somewhat of a social political message. You know, you might feel kind of strongly about this one way or the other, but it is trying to kind of have a message about kind of obviously how kind of screwed over ultimately the Native Americans were and that kind of stuff. Okay. Maybe I'll say as well, there was a couple of kind of practical effects there for a low budget movie that I think worked okay. I mean, it's not particularly gory, but there was one or two practical effects that I thought worked alright. Okay. But let's start with maybe what doesn't work. Okay, so let's talk about the killer himself. Damon is the name of this killer. Now, he is credited as Michael Madsen as the killer. But it's obvious that there is just someone else in the mask when we see him practically through the whole movie. And there's a couple of scenes right at the end of the movie where the mask comes off, and it's, you know, obviously we see Michael Madsen's face, but then Michael Madsen does like the voiceover for the kind of the characters in the sort of the bulk of the film. So we have a kind of a masked killer who's clearly like a very slenderly built guy, with Michael Madsen doing a kind of voiceover that does not fit the kind of the character, and it really seems like a voiceover rather than kind of, you know, natural kind of sounds that would be coming out of someone in doing a physical situation and things like that. And then we kind of have the reveal that like the two scenes that Michael Madsen is in at the end of the movie, when it's clearly obviously not him for the rest of the time. So it's kind of like they've obviously had Michael Madsen for like a day, and, you know, he's shot his two scenes where you actually see him, and then just done a kind of like a voiceover for the rest of the stuff. But it's really jarringly obvious. Now, the other thing with the killer, it's nothing to do with Michael Madsen necessarily, but the choice of the filmmakers here is to kind of lessen the impact of him being a slasher by having him in this kind of like being essentially a hired hitman. The problem is that this killer kind of feels like kind of cut between the two, sort of, you know, a hitman and a slasher, and doesn't really kind of totally go into either one. And the kind of the scary elements, I suppose, the more horror elements, are unfortunately diluted by him constantly kind of talking about the ring and everything like this, and sort of like it really detracts from the kind of like the kind of the unknown, the spooky atmosphere, or the kind of the menacing, lurking atmosphere that, you know, obviously a slasher might have. If we look at things like, you know, Michael Myers and stuff, the slasher here, you know, he's kind of like is talking a reasonable amount, and we know his goal there is to kind of steal this ring and things. So it does undercut, but it looks a little bit silly when you have this guy who is meant to be a professional criminal, like running around in a quite a cumbersome mask, it has to be said, and using like a tomahawk thing rather than a kind of like a gun with a silencer and things like this. It just doesn't really work, if you ask me. I appreciate the idea to have a little bit of a different take on it, and I think it is, I think, a way you can kind of differentiate yourself from a lot of other kind of movies that have a very sort of similar kind of premise. But I don't know if it was properly kind of well executed. Let me just put it like that. What else? I think the acting here is unfortunately on the weaker side from the majority of the cast here. A lot of the cast seeming very uncomfortable with delivering lines. There's a couple of guys who I think do a better job. I think there's like the kind of the jock guy, for example, I actually think plays the kind of a pretty good stereotypical kind of jock character. I actually thought he was probably the most confident actor here, but the majority of your other cast seem particularly kind of like, you know, just kind of very much a B-level kind of style of acting here, very kind of unconfident, and kind of not really delivering a believable kind of dialogue and things like that. It's not helped by the dialogue, which is very kind of cheesy, very exposition heavy at times, you know, and really having to point out some kind of plot points. Oh, look, there's this map on the wall that tells you that this was, you know, this house was built on this burial ground, things like this. So it's kind of like the dialogue isn't particularly good. As the story goes, there's just some silly elements in this that don't really make any sense. For example, we have these 6 characters that are there for a party, yet 2 of the women take either a bath or a shower. I mean, who takes a bath or a shower at a party? It's stupid. And it's ultimately just an excuse to get the kind of the female cast to get their tops off. And there is a fair amount of that in this movie. So, you know, maybe that's something that's going to be said, and that's fine, but it just seems unnecessary. It just seems like a kind of like, you know, let's have a naked scene and we have to find a reason why. So again, it doesn't really make sense. There's additional scenes of this movie that kind of show our killer essentially hurting other people, but it's nothing to do with the story. It's kind of like these kind of completely random people that have absolutely no bearing on the plot, and it feels out of place because of the way this kind of character is kind of set up. And then we kind of have, we have to talk about the ending here, because the ending is so drawn out. Oh my God, it was like the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. It was like, it just never seemed to end. They wanted to have this kind of crime element introduced, and I have mixed feelings about that, but it was just going on and on and on. It was just way too drawn out. The whole film itself just is somewhat kind of amateurish feeling. You never really get a sense of scares. They undercut the killer. There's not really a particular amount of gore in it. The acting is quite poor. People make kind of dumb decisions and don't act like kind of real people. Again, the plus that I can say, they tried to have a little bit of a different sort of take, and there is a sort of social political message in it, and it does obviously try to sort of, have this kind of like moral kind of sort of tale within this film as well. But nonetheless, the end result is a pretty unremarkable movie, and I'm being kind by referring it to that. I don't know if I would really recommend this movie, to be honest. Even though it does try to have some originality, the end result, the execution here is pretty poor. I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.